Hi, I'm Don Blackwell, and this is Aaron Gallagher. We would like to welcome you to a brand new program on the Gospel Broadcasting Network. It is called Answering the Error. On this series, we will be taking videos that we have found on YouTube and in other places on the internet, videos that teach religious error, and we're going to examine them in the light of the Bible. And we want to say at the very beginning, it is not our intention to be combative. We are not trying to be ugly toward anyone. Our intention is simply to teach the truth. You know, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1 says that we are to test the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. John chapter 8 and verse 32, Jesus said, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And so, Aaron, this really becomes a heaven and hell issue, doesn't it?
It does. You know, it's really important to get that out there at the beginning, because Matthew 25:46, in one of the judgment scenes, it talks about heaven and hell as being everlasting or eternal, and it uses the same word in Greek. So we have reached out, if anybody's curious, we've reached out to both of these men, and we really are hoping to just teach sound doctrine and hopefully take as many people to heaven as we can.
And so this is a very serious issue. We're not trying to pick a fight with anyone. We're concerned not only about the souls of the people watching this program, but also about the souls of the people that are presenting this material. Now, the video that we're going to be examining today is one that we pulled from YouTube, where there are two different denominational individuals, two men. They are discussing the topic of baptism, and particularly whether or not it is necessary for salvation. And they're going to argue that it is not necessary. And so what we're going to do is play the video. We're going to make some stops as we go, and we're going to examine the error in the light of the Scriptures.
Okay, let me give you just a couple of verses, and then we'll go and look at some Scripture that is relevant to the topic. Okay. First of all, it might not surprise people. I'm going to quote Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace is something you get when you don't deserve it. For by grace we are saved through faith, and that not of ourselves. It is a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no man should boast. This is relevant because it would be true, Rick, right? If anybody went to heaven who wasn't baptized, we already know the answer to that question, right? Yep. So let's take a look at somebody who we believe is righteous, which is the term for those that are saved and are going to be in relationship with God forever, who was not baptized, who is in fact in heaven. In fact, it says this guy has nothing to boast about. Why? Because he didn't do anything, including get baptized, except believe. Okay? His name is Abraham. Now, this is something that somebody's going to say, well, he's talking about an Old Testament guy. But let's look what it says right here in Romans chapter 4, verse 3. It says, if Abraham, actually this is verse 2, if Abraham was justified by works, he's got something to boast about. Okay? In Ephesians 2 it says, we don't have a right to boast because it's not as a result of our works. But it says, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So Abraham didn't do anything, okay, except have faith in the covenant-keeping God, and God reckoned that to him as righteousness. And so almost everybody, I don't know anybody who doesn't believe that Abraham's in heaven.
Okay, Aaron, there's a lot here. Mm-hmm. First, he says that Abraham didn't do anything, and he cites Romans chapter 4 and verse 2 that says Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Now, how do you explain that? Is it really true that Abraham's righteousness was based on nothing but faith?
Well, it's interesting. He quotes Romans 4:2, and now Romans 4:2 quotes a passage from the Old Testament from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. And then he says, one of the things is he says, Abraham didn't do anything. I think it's important to remember that's Genesis 15:6 that Romans 4:2 quotes. That's not Abraham's initial relationship with God. Right. Abraham's initial relationship with God started in Genesis chapter 12, where if I flip back here, it says that God called, he told Abraham to go out into a land that he would show him, and Abraham obeyed that. Genesis 12:1, now the Lord said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family. And you can continue to read verse 2, I'll make you a great nation. Verse 3, and in all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. Well, then I turn over to Genesis 22, and you find something out about Abraham's obedience. Now, Genesis 22:18, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Why? Because you did nothing? No, because you have obeyed my voice. And you go even to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. I won't flip there, but it says Abraham by faith obeyed. The idea that obedience leads, it's faith. Faith is obedient. The word faith in Greek and belief, we have to be careful of the context. Sometimes it means just a simple belief. Oh, I believe that. Sometimes faith is referring to the gospel, the system of faith. And so connecting passages like Ephesians 2:8 and 9, saved by grace through faith, we got to be careful. That's the system of faith. That's the gospel. Right. And also Abraham was never commanded to be baptized. That was a different covenant. So
now let me ask you this question. He cites Romans chapter 4 and verse 2 that says Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Oftentimes people like this gentleman will say that they will camp out in Romans chapter 4 and say Abraham was saved by faith, not works. And he'll say the context even specifically says not works. And as you mentioned, the passage that is quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 4 is Genesis 15:6. Now what is interesting, later in the New Testament, in the book of James chapter 2, James also quotes Genesis 15:6. But James says this in James 2:23. He says, "You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only." And so you've got two different books of the Bible that both quote Genesis 15:6. In Romans, he quotes Genesis 15:6 and says, not by works. James quotes Genesis 15:6 and says, not without works.
That's right.
It almost sounds like James is contradicting Paul. How do you explain that?
Well, it's interesting. The idea that James and Romans reconciling Romans 4:2 and James 2:21 is one of the reasons that Martin Luther said, just throw the book of James out, just straw epistle. Instead of thinking, well, if some works are required and some aren't, maybe there are different types of works. Some people will try to say, oh, well, James 2 is talking about your faith before men. They'll say it's lateral. And Romans is talking about your faith before God. Well, that's not true, because in James chapter 2 and verse 14, at the end of that sentence, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? It's talking about salvation. And in the next few verses, it even references a similar situation to, if you see one of someone that's naked and destitute of food, and you say, depart in peace, be warmed and filled. That's reminiscent of Matthew 25. I was naked and you clothed me. Right. That's talking about eternal salvation. So they're both talking about salvation. The difference is James is talking about works that are in an obedient faith, right? And Romans talking about works of the law of Moses. Okay. If someone's watching, go read Romans 3. You see works of the law. That's the law of Moses.
Okay, that's right. So you've got two different New Testament authors citing Genesis 15:6. One says not by works, and the other says not without works.
That's right.
But they're talking about two different types of works.
That's exactly.
One in Romans is referencing works of the law of Moses, and James is referencing works of obedience. And so exactly you can't go to Romans 4 then to say that you don't have to have works of obedience.
No, you're exactly right. And the other big point he made in there was speaking about Abraham.
Right.
Abraham lived under a different covenant, a different set of instructions from us.
Right.
And that's, in the nicest way to say this, that's a very basic understanding of the Bible. Because if I didn't understand that the book of Genesis was not a covenant I lived under, then I might go out and try to build an ark like Noah did.
Right.
That wasn't given to me. There's a reason we don't offer animal sacrifices today, because Jesus Christ fulfilled that and took it out of the way.
Right.
And so we need to look now for, as Christians, starting in Acts chapter 2, that's the new Christian covenant that we live under. So Abraham absolutely is in heaven. The New Testament even says, sit down in the kingdom with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that right now he's in paradise.
Right.
One day he'll be in heaven, but he lived under a different covenant.